So here's a tutorial then on the high status of sport in Australia, and I thought we'd start off by looking at an overview of the concepts involved in this topic area. And what we'll do, if we move on to the next slide, is we'll go through each of these points and build up the mind map by individual topic area so that we can build up a greater understanding of how this topic comes into play and its relevance. So as you will have seen, there are a number of areas to look at, and we'll start off by looking at this concept of tradition. First of all, we need to be aware that a lot of these sports played in Australia are in fact British in origin, and that they were adopted by the Australians. Examples of those would be cricket and rugby. If you mention these points, you'll be scoring well, and of course you need to mention as well that these British sports are a reflection of the colonial times and the British Empire. Similarly, we might talk about the fact that traditionally throughout history Australians have been successful in their sports, particularly their national teams. If we think about their netball teams and their cricket teams and their rugby teams on an international stage, they've known some considerable success throughout history. Another concept, perhaps less familiar, is this idea of the bush culture, sometimes referred to as the pioneering spirit, and involves concepts of manliness. If we examine that a little bit more closely, we'll see that the bush culture, manliness, conjures up characteristics of courageousness or courage and strength and perseverance and fortitude and discipline, self-discipline and ruggedness, and the idea that all of these characteristics are required in order to be successful both in life and in sport. So the bush culture is reflected through sport, if you like. A nice point to mention if you were able to remember that. And the last point with tradition is this idea of the Australians' history of victory, particularly against the British and the English, and the notion of pommy bashing, the idea of beating the English at their own game. So that is tradition. We move on to the next concept, which is natural resources. And we know that Australia is a vast, open country. It's huge, lots of space therefore for activities to take place, and we're talking about places like the outback, beaches, mountains, and of course the desert. And with that, plenty of opportunity and choice, and those two are interlinked. But we need to talk about examples. What sort of activities might people take part in? Well, we can say that there's backpacking that takes place, sailing, skiing, beach culture, and therefore there are lots of things which would be really, really useful to include in an answer there. Moving on, we would look at the climate, and we might say that there's a very favourable climate in Australia, which allows for a comparison with the UK. Essentially, it's much better than the UK. But what does that mean in itself? Well, it means that outdoor sports and outdoor activities can be played all year round, which then means that it's much more reliable in terms of organising sports, and there are fewer or no cancellations. So mention favourable climate. We can also talk about the economy and the government and the link there. We can talk about government in the sense that the government is responsible for funding sport, and with that it can be used for gaining votes. Obviously, the more the government funds sport, the more likely they're going to be popular, and therefore when election time comes around, they might well achieve a greater number of votes. But also this idea of the country is relatively affluent, it has a reasonable amount of money to spend on sport, and by doing that it might boost the nation, make the nation feel better about itself. And of course there's a commercial business side to sport. For example, Australian Rules. We know that Australian Rules is a multi-million dollar business. Obviously that's Australian dollars. Another concept we might want to bring in is the fact that it's an everyday life. Sport is part of everyday life. We're outdoors, the culture, the climate again allows for that. So we might talk about the outdoor life that's interlinked with the culture of living in Australia. A couple of other points we might want to say. The fact, first of all, then, is that sport acts as a vehicle for nation building. So sport unites the country. There's identity, there's a common identity through sport, which allows for recognition of Australia on an international scale, and you can see that they're interlinked there. So the unity, sport unites, it identifies the country, allows recognition, particularly at an international level. When you think about the Olympic Games, Australia are always right up there. On a social point of view, a number of things we could also talk about. For example, we can talk about the idea of, through sport, hopefully this notion of equality is promoted, and this idea that sport is available for everyone to take part in, which on the surface would seem to be very positive. There's also this idea that it's a health bringer. We have this notion, don't we, that Australia is a healthy nation, and by taking part in sport promotes health, and therefore the concept of the balanced, active, healthy lifestyle. But also there's this notion that actually taking part in sport, bearing in mind that Australia is a relatively young nation, is that it's fashionable, and therefore it's a good thing to be seen to be active. The last major point that I wanted to talk to you about was the influence and the impact of the media on sport, and the fact that in Australia media coverage is very extensive, is wide, and that would be seen in television. Particularly in some states, in some areas, sport is focuses on school sport and university sport, but also, as we might expect, newspaper coverage is vast as well. And also we might lastly finish off by saying that sport is big business. It's a big business, it's massively commercial, and therefore, because it's prevalent in the media on a regular basis, it's something which maintains the high status of sport in Australia. There are plenty of things to talk about. If you were asked a question about this, I think the model is, if you can talk about the key points, the main branches that come out of the mind map, and then develop them further, which are the smaller branches, you'd be scoring very well in this topic area. I hope you found this useful, and good luck if you get a question.